Joining me now, NBC News White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor and NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Cheung and CNBC senior economics reporter Steve Liesman will join us in just a moment. Yamiche, I want to start with you. What is the reaction inside the administration to another brutal day on Wall Street?
Well, it's really interesting, Kristen, because, of course, as we know, the president did say when he was running for president, running for re-election, that he was going to put in tariffs. He said, other countries to pay what they owe to the United States. And there has been this messaging from the president that these tariffs are negotiating or negotiable, rather, though the White House, in talking points that the NBC News obtained, said that this was not actually a negotiation. These tariffs were not doing that. But the president saying he's talking to countries, including Vietnam. That being said, it's interesting. Online, the president was almost hinting that this was sort of what he wanted to happen, even though it's hard to see that this would be what he wanted to happen. He reposted online a post that said something to the effect of President Trump is playing chess as others are playing checkers, and it had some illustrations of the market numbers and showing sort of all of the different things that are going on with the Dow plummeting and otherwise. That being said, you have Americans who are in the middle of this, and there is this split screen happening where you have, of course, the markets going down. You have Americans worried about a recession, people talking about how the cost of living is going up. And then you have President Trump at his golf course meeting with allies, but posting about golfing. But the president doesn't seem to think that that's going to hurt him at all. And again, there are some voters who are saying that they understand that this might be some short-term pain for long-term gains, which is what the president has also been saying. But really interesting to see the president try to flip this and say, well, maybe this is part of what I wanted, and this is part of my grand plan here, Kristen.
Yeah, the president saying this is akin to an operation on a sick patient, the U.S. economy being the sick patient. And Yamiche, that takes me to my next question. That includes short-term pain and the type of pain that you're talking about. But what is the administration saying about just how long it anticipates this pain is going to last for Americans?
Well, Kristen, that is the key question, right? How long is it going to be that we're going to see the Dow dropping in the way it is? How long are we going to see the president and the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, going back and forth with the Fed chair saying that he believes these tariffs are going to increase inflation and also possibly slow the U.S. economy? It's not clear from what I've been talking to White House officials or when the president has been speaking to reporters all week, whether or not he really has a timeline for this. All he's been saying is that Americans are going to have to bear with him, that there's going to be some pain, and that hopefully this will be better for America on the other side. He's been saying that these tariffs long term are going to make America richer, even though economists have said that this is really like a tax on the American people and that this is in fact going to make a number of things go up higher, including appliances, cars, all sorts of things. And again, Americans wanting to know how long this is going to last, but we just simply don't know, Kristen.
Yeah, and Yamiche, is there any discussion about a strategy for explaining this in a more thorough way to the American people? Is, for example, President Trump planning to hit the road to take his message about tariffs all across the country?
Well, it's really interesting, Kristen, because we did have that story that was about President Trump and his reluctance to travel, because in the first term, White House officials told me and some of our colleagues that the president felt like he had to be out there in the country holding rallies. We covered some of them together when you were a White House correspondent here at the White House, Kristen, when we were talking about talking to folks who said they liked seeing the president on the road. But this is a second term, and the president is feeling more comfortable with being at the White House or being in Florida golfing, which is what he's done time and time again on most weekends here. The president is not right now saying that there's going to be a big strategy to go out into the country and talk to people. But I think as maybe we see the markets continuing to go down, and as we see even Republicans on Capitol Hill pushing back in some ways on these tariffs, we might have a strategy from the president going out into the country. But right now, what we're seeing is online posts and the president sort of feeling at ease with the idea that Americans are going to stick with him for now. Kristen.
All right. Yamiche Alcindor, thank you so much for your reporting from the White House. Steve, let me head over to you before I go to Brian. Put these 2 days into context for us. I mean, the numbers we are seeing at the closing bell, just staggering. The fact that all of the indices lost close to 5%. Can you put that into historic context for people?
Well, it's obviously the worst sell-off we've had since the pandemic, which came back very quickly. This 2-day sequence here was troubling. And I go back, Kristen, I think we talked about this yesterday. There was an attempt at a rally yesterday. That rally failed, which means that people tried to go in and buy that dip and couldn't. Another attempt at a rally today. People tried to go in, try to find some confidence. Maybe we've priced this in already. No, it went further down. We closed at or near the lows of the day. Not just from a technical point of view, but from a psychological point of view. That's not good news. We're trying to find the bottom here. From a practical point of view, what's happening, Kristen, is this attempt to price in these tariffs. And what does it mean? Who's going to be affected by how much? Who is going to be affected by the companies that are affected? How much will consumers be affected? JPMorgan put a 60% chance of a recession on today. Now, when that happens, earnings of corporations, they can fall pretty sharply. Should you price in a recession, or should you just price in, part of the way there? Finally, this issue of the mercurial way that Donald Trump does policy. You could have some of these things go away tomorrow or not. We heard very, very, contradictory guidance from the White House yesterday. We had Peter Navarro, one of his trade counselors, on our air. He said no negotiation. Donald Trump on Air Force One said we're willing to negotiate. And then he said this morning in a tweet, my policies are not going to change. So markets don't know what to think. I think they're finally getting serious about the idea these tariffs are here. They're here to stay. And according to the stock market, they're one of the most colossal economic mistakes that perhaps have ever been made.
Well, against that backdrop, we heard from Fed Chair Jerome Powell today, who had some really stunning remarks and talked about the fact that these tariffs were more sweeping than anticipated. He said that the U.S. should brace for increased inflation potentially and lower growth. Were you surprised by the tone that the Fed Chair took?
I think the Fed chair has tried to stay out of this fight for as long as he could. I felt like he no longer could. What happened on Thursday, as you know, Kristen, was these tariffs came in much more extreme than the market had anticipated. I believe much more extreme than the Federal Reserve had penciled into its models. And he was now in a place where he had to say, okay, folks, now we know these are larger, which means the economic effects will be larger than we thought. This puts the Federal Reserve in a very difficult position. Remember, the Fed's job, keep unemployment rate low, keep inflation low. Well, what are tariffs doing? They're likely to increase unemployment and increase inflation. It is rare to have both these things. We call them stagflation in the economics business, to have both these things happening at once because the Fed can't address it. So what the Fed chair said today, which, by the way, I think was part of the additional sell-off, is we can't do anything here. We can't address the weakness in the economy while we face inflation. And then he said very firmly, we are going to address inflation. We're going to make sure that an initial round of price hikes that come from tariffs do not become a second round of price hikes like we had from the pandemic. So that kind of firm talk said to the market, the Fed can't come to the rescue. Donald Trump is golfing. And the Republicans in Congress aren't doing anything about these tariffs. We're without a net here.
And yet, President Trump seems to think the Fed chair can take some actions. He posted on Truth Social calling on the Fed chair to lower interest rates. What do you make of that? And what do you think the Fed will do in the wake of what we've seen?
Well, let me tell you, Kristen, 8 years ago or so, if Donald Trump first was in office, that would have been the lead of our story, that the president of the United States had told the Fed chair to lower interest rates. That never happened. In the post-Trump world or the Trump 2.0 world, it's not really big news, right? Because the president has spoken this before. He has jawboned the Fed chair in the past. And we also see, by the way, that the Fed chair for the moment is ignoring the president, as many monetary policy experts believe he should right now. Now, that said, if there are obvious weaknesses in the economy, if these jobs numbers turn down to zero or negative, if consumer spending goes zero or negative, I believe the Fed will act. But it's going to be very difficult for them to act when you're bracing for a rise in prices directly due to tariff inflation.
All right, Steve Liesman, it has been an extraordinary 2 days for you and your reporting. Thank you for bringing it all to us. We really appreciate it. Brian Cheung, I want to head over to you. Let's talk about the practical impacts of these tariffs. I know you've been tracking that part of this story. What products do you anticipate Americans should expect to see the biggest price increases on?
Well, I mean, Kristen, given the fact that the United States is such a major importer of things from countries around the world, it could really be everything. And when we talk about the types of categories that kind of come to mind first, you think about, of course, the things that we import from China, given that they're the world's second largest economy and that they are currently a major trading partner with the United States. So categories like clothing, where you have some major producers that produce in factories in China, as well as things like electronics, where you have warnings from the likes of the Consumer Technology Association that laptops and smartphones could get as much as $200 to $300 more expensive per unit with the types of tariff rates that are now going to be in effect come next week, which would be 54%. Dishwashers, those are things that will likely get more expensive, not necessarily because of just the reciprocal quote unquote tariffs themselves, but also because of the steel and aluminum tariffs that were announced just a few weeks ago. And then there's, of course, produce, things like avocados, tomatoes that we get from countries like Mexico, which are now subject to a 25% tariff. That could get more expensive as well. So, again, these are major household consumption products that people will buy regularly on a regular basis with big name brands like Apple and Nike and what have you. These are the types of companies and products that consumers can likely expect to see price increases in.
And I think, Brian, folks are watching this and wondering, what's the time frame for all of this? Will prices start to go up tomorrow when they go out to the grocery store, or will it take a couple of months to set in? What type of time frame should people be bracing for?
Well, I mean, let's talk about the theory of it, because the tariffs, when it comes to those quote-unquote reciprocal tariffs that were announced earlier this week, that 10% baseline would take effect tomorrow, and then the reciprocal tariffs would take effect next Wednesday. So in theory, it could be as soon as tomorrow or next Wednesday, depending on what country it's coming from. If an item is waiting off of the shores of, let's say, the Port of Los Angeles, if it does get onboarded onto a truck, let's say, for example, on a Thursday morning next week, it could be right then that the price would get more expensive. But for other products, not necessarily the case. One example being automotives. When I talked to some dealers earlier on this week, they were telling me that they can sell through the inventory they have on the lot already because those were not tariffed when they purchased them and put them on the lot. So it could be maybe a few weeks before those tariffs start to bite. But they're saying it's really a matter of weeks, not necessarily months, for those price increases, which could be in the thousands for those vehicles, take effect.
All right, Brian Cheung, thank you so much, as always, for your insights. I'm joined now by Mark Zani, Chief Economist at Moody's Analytics. Mark, thank you so much for joining me. We really appreciate it. Let's dive right in. Look, JPMorgan analysts among those today signaling that they now assess the risk of a global recession is increased. JPMorgan saying it's at 60%. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with that, Christine. I mean, I think that's what the stock market is telling us. It's a lot of red, and it's going to wipe out a lot of wealth. I mean, by my simple calculation, we've lost $4 trillion in wealth. That's what U.S. households own. Their stock holdings are now worth $4 trillion less than they were when the market peaked back, 5, 6, 7 weeks ago. And it's all because of the trade war and the higher tariffs. And that's going to do damage. 60% of Americans own stock, and they're going to be more anxious, and they should be. I think they're going to go more cautious. And the American consumer is key to driving the American economy and the global economy. And if that consumer turns more cautious, I think the economy is at risk, and recession risks are very high here. And 60%, that sounds about right to me. I'll say one last thing. The president could take an off ramp here and turn things around pretty quickly. I mean, he's good at pivoting, declaring victory, moving on. Did that in his first term with that trade war, so it's possible. I'm hoping for that, but with each passing day, that looks less likely, and recession looks more likely.
And Mark, quickly, just to follow up on that, pivoting, taking an off-ramp would look like saying, hey, I've reached some negotiations and some deals with some of these biggest countries?
I cut a deal. That's what, go back to his first term, the war was with primarily China. He cut some kind of trade deal. At the end of the day, it didn't change anything of consequence. The trade balance with China is still the same. Nothing really changed, but we could do that same thing here, get off this trade war. And if they do, the markets will, find their footing, rally. And because we came into the year with an exceptionally strong economy, low unemployment, everything was going right. So the economy is in a good place. The only reason why we're having this trouble is because of bad policy.
And of course, China, speaking of which, announced overnight it's issuing 34% retaliatory tariffs on goods from the U.S. Help people to understand, Mark, what is the overall impact of that going to be on the U.S. and also global economies?
Well, it's going to cost jobs, right? I mean, 34%, that's a big deal. That's a really big, increase. And they're not buying stuff. The farmers are going to get hit first. They're focused on soybeans and corn and chicken, and, they're going to get crushed. We export machinery, chips, the pharmaceuticals, medical instrumentation, the list is on and on. So, instead of tariffs leading to more jobs, and obviously, that's the stated goal, this is going to result in less jobs, fewer jobs. And again, just go back to the first term and look at that trade war. Manufacturing jobs fell during the trade war. So companies invested less in the United States. Tariffs like this, particularly the scale of these tariffs are just extraordinary. It's going to do tremendous damage. I can't see a CEO of a major global manufacturing firm deciding to locate in the United States. Why would they? I mean, they don't know what the tariffs are going to be tomorrow, let alone 3 years from now when their factory opens, or 10 years from now when they're still producing at that factory. So if you don't know what the tariffs are going to be when they're this large, how can you possibly make a big investment? I just don't see it. So I think this is costing jobs, not creating jobs.
Finally, let me ask you about what President Trump posted today, directed at Fed Chair Jerome Powell. He said this would be a perfect time for Fed Chair Jerome Powell to cut interest rates. He is always late, but he could now change his image, and quickly. What do you make of that, the pressure against Jerome Powell? And do you think that the Fed should cut rates?
Oh, goodness gracious. My gosh. I mean, a bedrock, foundational aspect of the U.S. economy, of any economy, is an independent Federal Reserve Board, an independent central bank that can make decisions about what interest rates should be based on what's going on in the economy, not based on, politics. And that's what this Fed has done. It's built into their DNA. And we've got to preserve that. We've got to, and it's not, Kristen, it's not just about the reality of it, it's the perception of it. If people lose faith that the Federal Reserve is independent because of comments such as these, then, we're shaking that bedrock. So, hopefully, the Federal Reserve, and I think the Federal Reserve, Chair Powell is about as good as they come. He's going to do the right thing. But one other point here. What is the right thing? And that's the problem with tariffs when it comes to interest rates. It raises inflation. Yeah. No doubt about it. So what do you do about it? You raise rates, and it slows growth. What do you do about it? You cut rates. So which one do you do? I don't know. You got to wait and see. And that's what he's doing. And that's the right policy.
Mark Zandi, it is always so good to have your insights and your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us. I anticipate we will be talking to you quite a bit in the coming days and weeks. Thank you for joining us on this Friday.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or follow us on social media.